Welcome to Nillumbio's second forum, where we focus on the wonderful orchids of Nillumbik with Lydia Heap. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as traditional custodians of this land and all First Nations people across the country, today known as Australia. We hold great respect for their ancestral connections and deep knowledge gathered, retained and adapted across innumerable generations through strong communities. Appropriate care for this land was top priority and continues to be for many people. We feel gratitude for all who give it love in their everyday. For some reason, the recording of the forum started after the first minute, but not to worry, it was our welcome and acknowledgement. Only a few seconds of Lydia's talk is missing, so please keep watching and enjoy.
Just a small walk that I did a couple of weeks ago, and the idea is I've got some video of the track and then zooming in to show that you don't need to leave the track to see the orchids, that just about all the orchids in Nillumbik are on the path sides or even on the paths around. So I'll just share the screen. So this was a walk that I did. It was a 3 kilometres in Smith's Gully. It took about an hour and a half, and it was 2 weeks ago. So I'll get on with, so I've got videos of the pathway, and they're not all orchids. There are different plants as well as orchids out there. I'm an orchid nut, but this one's one of the pea flowers, the Canedia. Growing right near the path. This is the walking track, and if you zoom on in, people have trouble spotting the orchids normally, but they're right there on the side of the track. So the pictures are, this is a new camera that I've been using. This is just looks like a weedy pathway, which it has got quite a few weeds, but it also has a lot of the orchids right on the side of the track that you can easily come down and see. So quite often people will spot an orchid in the distance and go herring off the track for it, but they'll actually be trampling lots of closer ones. And often the first orchid you see, you might be really excited about, but virtually every time there'll be plenty more further along the track. So you should keep looking, and you very likely find one that's very close to the track. So this is one of my favourite. It's the donkey or the wallflower orchid, with the wax lips were in the background as well. These are the pink fingers, but in this case, all of these pink fingers were relatively white, which camouflages in quite well. These are the bird orchids, the big cousins of my little babies that I had in the pot. So the leaves are fairly obvious, but actually spotting the orchid can be a little bit difficult. They come in green or red or variations of them. The wax lips are generally fairly easy to spot, but there's quite a few different variations. The most of them are just the purple with the white spots in the middle, but you can get them from very pale or different colours. This is just a pan across showing a patch with several different types. There's pink fingers, the wax lips, some egg and bacon flowers, some more pink fingers, and an actual pink finger. So this is the musk caladina, and this is actually on the path here. They're growing right on the path. So I went back to this location this afternoon and took a photo of the path to show the orchids, and in the photo on the left, it's very hard to see the orchids, so I've circled them in red. And this is the actual path where there were cyclists riding along it today. And as you can see with the red circles, there are actually quite a large number of orchids on the actual path. So you don't, even walking on the path here, you run a risk of them. So you need to look even when you're on the path to make sure you're not standing on anyone. This wax lip again is growing right in the middle of the path and quite happily there. It gets a nice lot of sun and so far hasn't been run over or stepped on. The nodding green hoods were just right by the edge. They're quite a common one in Nillumbik. This one's relatively rare. My camera refused to focus in on it unless I had the water bottle behind it. And in the lower photo, it's showing where the water bottle's showing where the orchid is sitting. So it just looks like an empty path, but it's got orchids all around either side of it. Now, these are not orchids, but still quite pretty on the side of the track. An egg and bacon and one of the grass flowers. And then I've just got a few more photos of some of the other flowers that aren't necessarily orchids that I found in the same 1.5 hour walk. So, and again, all of these were from the track side rather than having to go off the track to see any of them. It's a maroon hood orchid and a violet there. It's the tall green hood orchid and some nice ferns. And then today I went out the same walk, so 2 weeks later, and there's now a lot of these bearded orchids, some lilies. I really wanted to photograph the salmon orchid, but they're right in bud and they're probably about 2 days off flowering. But some of the spotted sun orchids were out, which I really love these ones. They're always so bright and cheery. So that's a virtual orchid walk. So Vicky, do you want me to go on with the second one now?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay. So this is a tale of 2 orchids. We've got the Rosella orchid and the wine lip orchid. The Rosella is the pink one. So the Rosella orchid is, it's got a flora and fauna guarantee action statement. It's only found in Nillumbik, and the Royal Botanic Gardens has managed to propagate it. It says in the current sheet that there's 130 plants in the wild in 4 populations. I believe it got down to less than 50 plants, but it's now coming back up. And then the wine lip, we have the largest concentration of them in Nillumbik, and it hasn't been successfully propagated by anyone. Royal Botanic Gardens has tried and haven't managed it. It's critically endangered, and again, it's listed under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. One of the problems, though, with a lot of orchids is there's a lot of common names that overlap. So other states have wine lip spider orchids, which are not the same as our wine lip spider orchid, which is why we tend to use the scientific name whenever we can. So I'm heavily involved in the Panton Hill Bushland Reserves. We've just recently put these signs up showing the reserves and giving information on them.
Lydia, you haven't been sharing your screen, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so if you could do that, you probably need to change to the other file. If you go back to
I
your
haven't done
share
this
screen.
before.
That's all right. Yep.
Is it sharing now?
It's sharing, about to load. There we go.
Okay, sorry about that. So
that's okay.
The pretty pink one is the Rosella spider orchid, and the yellowy one is the wine lip. So that's the action statement information on the Rosella, which is endangered in Victoria, and the wine lip, which is critically endangered. And then this is the signage for the Panton Hill Reserves, giving a map and various information and where to find out more information. So these are owned by the Nillumbik Shire, but they're managed and by a user group committee, which I'm on, that interacts with the Shire to look after these reserves and protect them. So back in 2006, there was a draft management plan, and then public comments, and then another one, more public comments, and then the Panton Hill Bushland Reserve Systems user group was created. And part of all that process, I put in a submission along with others that I'd found the wine-lip spider orchid and the slender bearded orchid, which had not been recorded in the reserves, but I'd found them in the Bunjil Reserve and submitted that we should be protecting the area where they live. And eventually it came to pass. So for that biodiversity hotspot, horses and cyclists have been restricted from entering there with gates and pedestrian access, and the signage clearly shows no cyclists and no horses permitted into the biodiversity hotspot. So of the whole reserves, this is a map showing the whole of the reserves around Panton Hill and Smith's Gully. And then the yellow outlined area is the amount of the reserve that has been restricted from cyclists and horses. And then the two red squares are the actual areas that have been fenced off from everyone. So it's actually quite a small proportion of the reserves that's needed to be fenced off or restricted in order to protect these plants and animals. And as part of the process of doing this, horse riders obviously didn't want to stop using the reserves. So new horse trails have been constructed to go around the areas that have been restricted so that the horse riders can still do loops and walk and go right round the reserves rather than just coming to a dead end and having to turn around and go back. And that's been quite well received by the horse riders and the cyclists, and most of them are very happy to use these trails and give up the trail through the hotspot area. So the one that I found in 2003, I relocated it with the Shire, found the information that I'd sent them, and they asked me to help relocate it. We're looking for one leaf that's about 3 centimetres long in about a 10 hectare area, because when I'd found it originally, GPSs hadn't been in existence. So we managed to actually locate it and protect it with a tree guard. And then we got metal cages for them to protect them from the choughs. So the picture on the left shows it's actually helmeted orchids, the green leaves. So the bottom half of the picture shows a normal colony, but the top half shows where the choughs have been through and ripped up all the moss and pulled up some of the orchid plants. So you've got a yellowing leaves and bare patches there. So the choughs can do a lot of damage. So rare orchids need to be protected from the choughs with metal cages or other barriers. And when we started protecting the first wine lip that I'd found, we also discovered that there was these other rare plants around it. So there's a violet, it's got various names. I think mountain violet's the common one. And then this small yellow pea that's a ground hugging one. So they've also been enclosed in the biodiversity hotspot. And then a few years later, I found another wine lip in Bunjil that was very close to the pathway. Not enough room virtually to get a cage over it without impinging on the path. There had to be a cage specially designed for this particular orchid. And then someone working for the Shire found a third one. And so we had 3 of these orchids that listed under the flora and fauna guarantee, and so the council was able to secure some funding because of those orchids. So they created a orchid enclosure, one of those red rectangles, to enclose the biggest patch that we could find, and this reduces the grazing of native and introduced animals, and it reduces any foot traffic danger. And then there was hand pollinating, cross-pollinating with some that were on Parks Vic land with the ones that were on the council reserve. And we started to get lots of babies. So there'd been 1 and then 2 and then 3. And then I think the next year we had 60, and then we went up to over 200 the year after. And we're starting to get variations in the colour variations in the orchids. So I've just got a couple of different ones here. So these are babies of those first 3. And then we built the second enclosure around the babies of that first orchid that I'd found. So it's relatively hard to see. The picture at the small picture at the bottom is a picture of the enclosure. So from a small distance, you can't really see it. And then the larger picture shows a more close-up of it. And then because of the grazing pressure was reduced and they were protected, we suddenly had this orchid appear, which is the daddy longlegs, and it's listed as extinct in the Melbourne area. And we found out at that point that you can't actually get funding to save extinct plants. You can only get funding to save rare plants, but luckily this one was inside the enclosure that had been built for the wine lips. We also found a patch of the Mayfly orchids came up. They're mainly found in coastal areas and weren't generally known from the Nillumbik area in any numbers, but they've started to come up in greater numbers inside the protected enclosure. And so in the spider or the wine lip spider orchid enclosure, the one that we found near the path, we got the crimson spider orchid appearing, which was believed to be extinct in Nillumbik, and there's less than 10 populations known of it, and it's another flora and fauna guarantee plant, so that should ensure more funding to protect it. And it's growing within about 2 feet of the wine lip orchid. And so other work to help increase them, they were hand pollinated originally, but now we've started replanting and protecting the plants that are used by the pollinators. So the pollinators of most of these orchids are little wasps, and they're not actually feeding on the orchids. They're tricked into thinking that the orchid is the female. So the male wasp comes along and tries to pick up the female, but finds he's picked up a bit of orchid instead of the female. So these insects need all of their plants that they eat and their babies need. So we've been revegetating all of the plants that are needed by the extended family of animals. And we've been including nesting boxes because although the fences are done to exclude grazers and humans, they also exclude predators. So we're put up a lot of nesting boxes and also hollows in chainsaw hollows in trees. We've been trying out both methods. We get a lot of sugar gliders, which are the picture on the right, but we are getting an increasing number of the phascogales, which is the one on the left with the brushy black tail, which are highly endangered and are a target species as well to protect. We've also got the powerful owls nesting in the reserve, and we've got Dunarts also coming back. So then, and third generation has moved on outside of the protected enclosures and started expanding across other areas of the biodiversity hotspot. So this is a third generation one, which has been temporarily protected with a cage and a rabbit-proof fence. Whether we will actually fence it off with a full height fence, not sure yet, but there's now orchids across a much bigger area, maybe about spread across 10 or 12 hectares rather than just in 3 little discrete spots. Okay, so the Rosella orchid is the other one that I was going to talk about. It got down to about 50 plants in the wild and only in Nillumbik, but it turns out that it's relatively easy to propagate. So the Royal Botanic Gardens has been propagating it and building up the numbers of it. So it's nowhere near as rare as it used to be, but it's still like under 300 plants in the wild. So we had the Royal Botanic Gardens give Nillumbik some of them to plant into the enclosure that we'd made for the second wine lit, and this is the planting area for it. And you can see there's tiles on the ground, which are the Dunnart tiles to encourage the native. A lot of people call them marsupial mice. They're not actually mice, but they're about the size of a mouse. And so they're coming back into the reserves with these Dunnart tiles that have been placed around. And then all of the Rosella spider orchids that have been planted have been identified with tags and monitored. The first introduction of them was of tubers, and over 50% survived, which was quite a large amount. They were very pleased with that many surviving. And then a few weeks ago, a second lot were introduced into the same enclosure in the Nillumbik Reserve, and another lot were given to Parks Vic to put into their Christmas Hills Reserve. So now I'm just switching to some pictures from Deb Oliver, who we're going to be sending out the link to her page. We went out and looked at the St Andrew spider orchid, and then she went out with the cambids, or the ranger for the local area, into the Parks Vic Reserve, where he was dealing with the Rosella orchids. So they're obviously very pretty and charming. So he got the other half from the Royal Botanic Gardens to plant. And this is the original protective enclosure for the Rosella spider orchids, and they're located deep inside that. But now that they're being propagated, Cam has decided that everyone needs to see how pretty they are. So at the intersection of these two tracks, so Cam Beardsley's track and the Rosella track, is where you find the Rosella orchids planted by Cam Beardsley. And so he's made a garden bed for them right near the track, so that when they're in flower, anyone passing by can actually see them from the track, which they're one of the rarest orchids in Australia, and now anyone who wants to can see them. So these ones were actually sprouted rather than just the dormant tubers. So here he is planting them and then hand pollinating them, because we still don't have a huge number of the pollinators. We're tending to, with the orchids, try to get them to naturally pollinate, and then if they're getting towards the end of their flowering period and they haven't had natural pollination, they're getting hand pollinated. So I think we're getting 15 or 20% of the orchids at the moment being naturally pollinated, but that's up from about 0%. So hopefully the planting of the other species and the revegetation around it will start to increase the natural pollination of these orchids. So that was the two presentations I did prepared, and this is my book that I did about 1.5 years ago. It's not all the orchids of Nillumbik, but it's the majority of the common ones. And now there's only two in there, the flying duck orchid and that pretty one that was extinct in the Melbourne area. They're the only two that you can't see from a public footpath in Nillumbik. Those two are both under lock and key, but every other orchid in this book is visible from a pathway in Nillumbik.
Thank you, Lydia. That's terrific. Really wonderful information, and we're really grateful for you sharing all of that. Can you just
asked for half an hour and I've hit it virtually.
Can you just tell us a little bit about the symbiotic relationships and the reliance of fungi that orchids have in order just to survive, I suppose? And
Well, orchids are quite famous for being symbiotic with fungi. Every orchid species has to have a fungi with it in order to grow. The orchid seeds are so fine that they don't have any food stores in them. So when they germinate, they're not like a pea or a corn that's got a lot of food and can grow until it's got enough leaves to photosynthesize. Orchids can't do that, and they need the fungus to be associated with them. For when they germinate, the fungus helps feed the seedling until it's big enough to photosynthesize. And in fact, we've actually got quite a few of the orchids in Australia and some of them in Nillumbik that don't actually ever photosynthesize. They just work with the fungi and they don't have leaves themselves, or very little photosynthesis, if any. And so so all of the orchids are dependent on the fungi, and most of them have one specific fungi, and most of them also have one specific pollinator or a very few number of pollinators, which is why they're all different shapes and sizes. And although we can't tell it, they've got a lot of different smells because they're trying to mimic insects and trick them into thinking there's a female. And some of them have movable parts like the blunt green hood and the nodding green hoods. They can actually, when an insect lands on them, they can flick it a little bit, sort of like you'd see with the Venus flytrap, but a much smaller movement. But that's enough to flick them onto the polliner so that they grab the pollen when they fly off.
They're such a fantastic example of the importance of biodiversity being healthy. They really, yeah. And can you tell us, is there much information about how long tubers can survive underground?
There's very little information, but we're assuming that the wine lips that I found, it had been 26 years since they'd been seen in that area. And so we're thinking that maybe it was tubers under the ground there for that long. There's quite a few, like the hair orchid only tends to flower when there's a fire around. So there's several patches that I know that have gone like 10 years without flowering and often without many leaves, and then come up and flowered again when the conditions were right. So with these ones with like 1 3 centimetre long leaf, whether they were genuinely not present for 24 years or whether they were there but only in leaf form and never flowering, we don't really know, because until you're trying to find one leaf in a big patch of bush is pretty difficult, and most of the spider orchid leaves look fairly similar. There's only a few people like Cam Beardsall who can actually look at a leaf and tell you which species it's going to be. So there's not much research, because I mean, this takes time and it takes funding to do this sort of research. And generally you can get funding to protect a flora and fauna guaranteed plant, or you can get funding maybe if you're doing a PhD or an honours project, but those go for a few years, not for the extended period that we're looking at for how long orchids go.
Yeah, important work, that's for sure. And we've got a couple of questions. One is, what impacts of climate change have you observed in Nillumbik's orchids?
Well, I don't know whether it's climate change but we've had a few wetter springs and had more orchids out, but whether that's attributed to climate change or not. And there's so many localized pressures that I suspect they're probably more of a impact, whether there's deer grazing or not, whether there's human people trampling them or not, and diseases or local fire regimes are probably more important than global warming for most of them. But again, no one's really been able to study that. But pretty much we're looking at trying to help them and protect them regardless of what's causing the problem, just trying to help them get better.
Yeah, that's right. And that relates to a question that somebody else has asked, saying that they have orchids growing on their block and they seem to have diminished over the years. They do have rabbits, and would there be any point in caging some areas and seeing what comes up? And so everything that we cage, we notice there's significant transformation in what's able to grow if the grazing pressure is eased. Could you just talk a little bit about that? And also, once cages are installed, what kind of maintenance is required for fallen leaves and all those other things that happen when you cage?
If you use the sort of cages that I showed in my thing, they've got relatively wide spacing, so they don't tend to catch the gum leaves more, and so it's sort of wider spacing and weld mesh rather than like a chicken wire. So we don't tend to get a build-up of leaves on top of them at all. I mean, everyone knows how windy it is around Nillumbik. You get dried gum leaves falling on top and they'll just blow off the next storm. With the reduced grazing pressure, there is a danger of an increase in millipedes. So you may need to prevent millipedes. That can be done with bits of wet newspaper, and the millipedes will hide under there. Then you pick up the newspaper and dispose of them and the millipedes. But like with the second orchid enclosure that we built, we had no idea that there were all these other orchid species in there that weren't showing up, or there was only one or two plants showing up. And by just taking the grazing pressure off it, we just suddenly got this explosion of multiples of the plants and great big surprises like the one that's supposedly extinct. And if anyone goes out to the Dodd Street Reserve, that's a Parks Vic one in St Andrews, they've got about 5 orchid enclosures there. And it's really startling the difference between the inside and the outside of the enclosure. The outside is almost bare dirt and the inside is lush with lots of native grasses and other wildflowers as well as orchids. And it's got the biggest population of the wine lips in the world, but they're all inside the enclosure. There's very few of them that have survived outside the enclosure because of the rabbits grazing in the area.
And do we know, obviously they can be prolific when they're protected, but do we know why some survive better than others? For example, we can see many more caladineas in the wild than obviously the rosella. Is there any understanding about why that might be?
Different orchids depend on different fire regimes. So there's been experiments with going back to the sort of Aboriginal method of fire management of slow, cool burns in winter rather than the burn off before the summer fire season. Some of them require the ethylene from a fire smoke to make them grow. Some it may be to do with their fungus. If the fungus is more common, they'll be more common. If the fungus is hard to find, then they'll probably find it harder to grow. And also we get populations where we don't get flowering, we just get leaves for year after year. And we also get ones where we don't get much natural pollination, whereas in other reserves, we will get a lot of natural pollination. And it's a matter of studying and watching them to try to find out. And that's what anyone can do. That the scientists are trying to cover sort of the whole of Victoria or the whole of the Melbourne area or whatever. But it's us locals who know 2 reserves or 3 reserves really, really well and are out there every week and are seeing the changes from week to week rather than trying to get the big overall picture. So that's how I found the original wine lips. Was I walked the same path every single week for over a year, and so I could notice when there was little changes. And like the Parks Vic rangers and the Nillumbik Shire staff, they don't have the luxury to do that. And the amount of reserves they'd have to do. But if everyone looked at either their own backyard or their own local reserve and got to know it really well, they'd start to make observations which are scientifically valid, which others don't have time to make, and maybe even answering questions that others haven't asked yet.
That's really important to consider. There's another question asking for natural pollination. What signs do you look for before proceeding to manual hands-on pollination?
It's quite easy. Virtually all the orchids, the area below the orchid swells up quite markedly within 1 or 2 days of them being pollinated. It starts to form seed capsule, and the actual petals and that die off because they're not needed anymore. So for the majority of the species, it's fairly obvious to see when a flower has been pollinated or not after a couple of days.
Yeah, terrific. And someone is also asking if you have any tips for establishing orchids in a nature reserve. And I guess given all that we do know about the need for fungi to be present and all sorts of pressures to not be present, it's a complex question.
Yeah, I mean, if natural ones can be encouraged to come back, that's good. But there's places like the Warrandyte State Park, they have the nursery and they have limited variety of orchids, but like these blunt green hoods that grow quite happily in the pot, you can purchase them from those nurseries, or there's a few native plant nurseries around you can purchase orchids from if you want to establish some. You won't get the rare species, but the ones that are easy to grow. And even though they're easy to grow, they're still very beautiful and interesting.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
those ones will come with the fungi already on their roots.
And someone's asking about the fungi, whether it has a name. And I think you mentioned before that there's diverse needs for the different orchids.
Yeah, just about every orchid has a different fungi, and yes, they would have names, but I wouldn't have a clue what they are, and you probably need a microscope to tell them apart.
Yeah.
So I haven't really looked into that fungi side of things.
And it really goes to show the importance of how we need to preserve our local soils
Yeah.
and ensure their integrity.
But
And
also, just about every Australian native plant, or everyone has fungi growing with their roots, but things like eucalypts or the bigger ones, they're not so fussy, and they can often have 7 or 8 species for one plant growing at the same time, and they're not dependent on the fungi to get germinating. The fungi just helps them along. But also, I'm not sure if we know if any of the fungi for the orchids also go on to other plants, or if they're exclusive to the orchids. But that's not an area that I've really been able to. I mean, this is a hobby for me, not my job, but I'm sure there's other people who are looking at those sort of things. I know that the Royal Botanic Gardens is growing them in flasks where they have a sterile medium, and then they introduce a particular fungi. And I'm assuming they're doing things like that to work out what fungi are best and those sort of things, but it's beyond me at the moment.
yeah, yeah. And so somebody's asking where they could read more about the relationships between rare orchids and their pollinators.
There is a good book which I wasn't able to find to bring tonight. I was in a bit of a hurry tonight when I left home, but there is a book called Victorian Orchid Pollinators out there. I think the library has a copy, and there's also web pages. I think you're going to send out some links of
That's
the
right.
the web page that I start with is the Retired Aussies, because they have time to go out and photograph orchids, and so their web page is really very good, and then it's got jumping off spots to other specialist areas. But I think the idea is start looking on the web and you'll find things.
Yeah, I think so. And we will certainly be sending out information to people with links and things that people can follow up on. And someone else is asking, was that first walk you spoke of in Smith's Gully?
Yes, it's in Smith's Gully and it's on Parks Vic land. It's one of my favourite walks. There's not a lot of people that go up there. But you can find very similar, Boomers Reserve's probably actually got more. Orchids Dodd Street Reserve in St Andrews is also very good. I like to send people to those two because they've got very well maintained tracks and the orchids are protected, the really vulnerable ones. The Bunjil Reserve also has very good walking tracks and a lot of these orchid species in it. But I think this time of year, a lot of the bush reserves out in Nillumbik, you'll see, if not the same orchids, at least a decent number of orchids. And in Nillumbik, we have at least one orchid in flower every day of the year.
Aren't we so fortunate? Incredible.
Mm.
And someone's asking, what conservation project do you hope to see start or continue in the next 5 years in Nillumbik? And what are you most excited about that will be going on?
Well, what I'd like to see is that we've got these fundings to protect endangered orchids, and we've put up fences around endangered orchids and had other orchids come up. What I'd like to do is for us to pick an area that, like in the Yangai Reserve, which doesn't currently have any rare orchids, and fence off an area in the same way and see if we get anything there. Because at the moment you can't really get funding to just fence off a let's see. You've got to sort of prove that there's something there to save before you can save it.
Yeah.
But I'd be very interested if we could fence off some random areas and just see what comes up rather than targeting in. Maybe nothing would, but I suspect that we would get something, even if they're common species, and be able to see what difference the grazing pressure makes. And although people don't like being locked out of areas, the percentage of the reserves that are being fenced off are very minuscule. And with consultation with the user groups, we're making sure that there's tracks remain open and that there's alternate ways around if a track is closed off. But also a lot of tracks in the area are closed off because of mine cave-ins and erosion and other reasons. So it's not sort of just a given that a track will exist forever.
No, and that's where having those conversations with everybody is so important, so that there's greater awareness and understanding. And as you said, those different users were quite happy to find an alternative way. So
yeah, well, the user group for the Panton Hill Reserves includes mountain bikers, horse riders, dog walkers, bird watchers, orienteering person, and nature lovers. So we can actually meet everyone's requirements. We can still have very rare orchids. We can increase the number of rare animals like the phascogales and the dunnuts and the powerful owls, and everyone can still get out there and enjoy it, rather than it being fully locked down like some conservation reserves are. And we figured that if people are out there and enjoying it, they're more likely to want it protected than if it was sort of locked up and no one knew about it and could go there. People wouldn't care so much about it. But the people we've introduced to it have come to love the reserves and feel that it is worth protecting. It's not just some old bush, that it is valuable to keep. So although it's not ideal to have dogs in a reserve where you're trying to preserve wildlife, having dog walkers there appreciating it and wanting to protect it is probably of more value than the detriment of having online dogs there. And the same with the horse riders and the mountain bikers. They cause a little bit of erosion or weed control, but you can educate them away from causing too many of those problems. And you get a hell of a lot more support by having those groups on side and involved in the reserves.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And these are all very exciting possibilities for the way the whole of Nillumbik could be in the future, and the way that all of us can participate by planting those other plants that the insects rely on, that all the other creatures also rely on, not just the orchids themselves.
But with the reserves, we've also proved that it can't just be staff doing it. So there's no way that just Nillumbik staff, or in these other reserves, just the Parks Vic staff can do it. They need the community help. We do a lot of hand weeding, track maintenance and other stuff. It's just too big for paid staff to manage. So it does need community involvement. And most of, certainly Nillumbik and Parks Vic, are willing to take on community help volunteers and community help, obviously with COVID restrictions now, but they've realised that it's much easier to weed a patch if you've got 5 willing helpers than doing it on your own. And it's much easier to carry in a bundle of 300 protective stakes into plants if you've got 10 volunteers rather than just you and your mate.
Yeah, that's right. And it's one of the things that we hope to also try and coordinate through Nillumbio is communal efforts for all sorts of different things. So we look forward to what will eventuate. Are there any more questions from people? We've just got one comment from Corbin, aged 6, saying he's reported in the chat that he saw a snake in Bunjil Reserve yesterday. So thank you.
There's a very nice one in Boomers Reserve, a lovely copperhead that I keep visiting, but I don't tend to tell people where it is because it likes to be left on its own. There's also a large number of lovely blue tongues around in the reserves.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. And somebody's just said that the Friends of Bunjil, let me find it, meets once a month, and that you can contact them for information. We'll send out some of that information too, if you like.
Yep.
There's another question saying, are there particular biodiverse reserves that you feel need more attention from the community?
I think all of them could do with more attention, but we're doing quite well out in the Smith Gully, Panton Hill, St Andrews area. I don't tend to wander much further than that because I'm busy enough in this area, but I'm sure everywhere there are reserves that need help. I mean, the Friends of Eltham Copper Butterflies, they've set up a good system where that they're really on board with helping that, and they're quite well known. If every reserve could have people like that helping it, I'm sure we could get a lot out of it.
Fantastic. And on that note, which is a call to action for everybody, we will say thank you very much for your presence and for sharing your knowledge and your passion for all these wonderful things. Another message has just come through saying thank you. So yeah, thanks very much, Lydia. We really appreciate it. And
I'm happy to talk to anyone if they drop in at the Smith Gully shop. People keep bringing photos and coming in wanting more information. So if I get to know people, I'm more likely to let you know where to go to see more unusual things.
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate it. And everybody will be sending you some follow-up information that, you can start your research and go down all the little burrows that you might find. So thank you all and good night.